Okay, so when you hear Silk Road, you probably picture a single dusty path with some camels, right? But what if I told you it wasn't a road at all? What if it was something way, way smarter? We're going to dive in because when you look closer, the ancient Silk Road starts to look less like a highway and a whole lot more like a vast thinking network.
So let's just kick things off with a pretty wild idea. What if the Silk Road was a brain? Or, for the more digitally minded among you, what if it was the world's very first internet? That's the lens we're going to use for this whole explainer, looking at this ancient web through the modern science of neural networks.
And that right there is the key thing to understand. This system wasn't designed by some emperor with a grand master plan. Nope, it grew organically. It was this incredible, decentralized, self-optimizing network that actually learned, adapted, and figured out the most efficient ways to connect civilization. Kind of like a brain forging new neural pathways.
To really get how this worked, we first need to break down the anatomy of this ancient network. How did it actually function like a biological or a digital circuit?
Well, first up, you've got the nodes. Think of these as the network's synapses. These weren't just sleepy dots on a map. Cities like Samarkand were these bustling processing hubs where goods, ideas, and culture were received, integrated, and then fired off down the line.
And connecting these nodes, those were the edges, the trade routes themselves, basically the wiring of the network. But what's so fascinating is that the value of these connections wasn't just about how short the distance was. Some of the longer paths were actually much, much stronger. And that brings us to this idea of synaptic strength. Just like in our brains, paths that were used often and reliably, meaning, they were safe and you could make a profit, they got stronger. The more a route was traveled, the more reinforced it became, while the dangerous or unused paths, well, they just weakened and faded away.
Now, this is where it gets really, really cool. Look how perfectly the challenges of ancient travel map onto modern tech concepts. Simple distance? That's just latency or path length. Super difficult terrain? That's resistance. It weakens the signal. The risk from bandits or raiders? That's basically stochastic noise in a system, unpredictable interference. And get this, a political alliance like the Pax Mongolia acted like what programmers call a negative weight. It actively reduced the cost of travel, making a path way more attractive and efficient even if it was physically longer.
So, with this basic structure in place, how did the network actually grow from just a few sparse connections 4,000 years ago into this massive, continent-spanning web?
It all happened through a process called preferential attachment, but you probably know it as the rich get richer effect. New merchants weren't just randomly wandering into the desert. They were overwhelmingly likely to head for the big, established hubs like Xi'an or Rome, places that already had markets, infrastructure, and some level of security.
And amazingly, this isn't just a vague concept. There's real math behind it. Now, don't worry about the symbols here. The core idea is actually super simple. The chance of a new merchant connecting to a city is directly tied to how many connections that city already has. Popularity literally becomes a magnet. The big get bigger, and they do it exponentially.
This process created what scientists call a scale-free network. You have a few massive hubs that dominate everything, connected to tons of smaller peripheral nodes. This design made the network incredibly resilient. If a small oasis town dried up, it didn't really matter to the whole system. But it also created a massive vulnerability. A targeted attack on a major hub, like the Mongol siege of Samarkand, could shatter the entire network.
And yet, despite its enormous scale, the Silk Road was also a small world network. And what that means is that goods, and more importantly innovations like papermaking or the stirrup, could travel from one end of Eurasia to the other with absolutely shocking speed.
So how did it pull that off? It was this clever combination of dense local trading webs. Imagine all the towns in a single valley trading back and forth constantly, and a few crucial long-distance shortcuts. These were like the express lanes that bypassed entire regions, connecting faraway parts of the network and making the world feel a whole lot smaller.
All of this builds to the network's real hidden genius, its radical decentralization. This is where the analogy to the internet becomes completely undeniable. Think about this for a second. Almost no single merchant ever traveled the entire 7,000-mile route. It just didn't happen. Instead, goods were passed along in stages, from one caravan to the next, at these major hubs. This is caravan switching, an ancient version of the packet switching that powers our internet today, where data is broken up into little pieces and relayed from router to router.
And this just perfectly illustrates that decentralized logic. Each merchant was, in effect, a local router. They didn't need a map of the entire world, they just needed to know the best way to get their goods to the next hub. No central command, just millions and millions of local decisions.
So if there's no central plan, how did millions of these local routers coordinate? Well, they used the exact same logic as an ant colony. It's this beautiful, elegant process called stigmergy. Instead of talking to each other directly, travelers left traces in the environment, worn paths, new wells, roadside inns that guided the next person. The environment itself became a kind of collective memory.
So here's the really amazing part. The network literally learned on its own. Every successful caravan reinforced a good path, like an ant laying down a pheromone trail. Bad paths, the dangerous or unprofitable ones, were just abandoned and forgotten. And over centuries, this simple feedback loop allowed the absolute best routes to emerge organically, solving an incredibly complex logistics problem without any central planner whatsoever.
Okay, so why does any of this matter today? Well, it matters because this ancient blueprint, it's being rediscovered and implemented right now in our most advanced technologies.
See, the power was in its autonomous nodes. Samarkand didn't wait for a memo from Rome or Beijing to change its trade policies. It reacted to local information from the caravans arriving that day. This kind of agility and local responsiveness is exactly what modern supply chains are desperately trying to replicate.
And just look at these modern parallels. It's unreal. That ancient pathfinding, stigmergy, is now being used as digital pheromone routing to guide swarms of warehouse robots. Caravan switching is the exact same logic behind massive intermodal shipping hubs. The network's redundant paths, that's the model for resilient mesh networks in our Internet of Things devices. We are literally building the Silk Road's ancient logic into our most advanced AI.
And this isn't just a metaphor anymore. It's being physically rebuilt. China's Digital Silk Road initiative is using blockchain to recreate that ancient decentralized system of trust. The old synaptic hubs of Xinjiang and Kazakhstan are booming again, with tens of thousands of freight trains, over 74,000, now blazing across what you could call the new Iron Silk Road.
And the network, it just keeps evolving. As our climate changes, a brand new neural pathway is opening up, the Polar Silk Road. It's this massive shortcut through the Arctic that dramatically slashes the travel time between Asia and Europe, and it is completely reshaping the global trade graph as we speak.
So, what's the big takeaway here? It's that the ancient world wasn't just building roads. It was building intelligent, self-learning systems. And as we design the future of autonomous, AI-driven logistics, it turns out that the most robust and resilient blueprint we have is a 4,000-year-old idea.